What is sleep?
Sleep is probably the single most effective thing you can do to reset your brain and body health. So that's a functional answer in terms of, what is sleep in terms of its benefits. Sleep as a process, though, is an incredibly complex physiological ballet. And if you were to recognize or see what happens to your brain and your body at night during sleep, you would be blown away. And the paradox is that most of us, and I would think this too, if I wasn't a sleep scientist, we go to bed, we lose consciousness for 7 to 9 hours, and then we sort of wake up in the morning and we generally feel better. And in some ways, that denies the physiological and biological beauty of sleep. So upstairs in your brain, when you're going through these different stages of sleep, the changes in brainwave activity are far more dramatic than those that we see when we're awake. And we can speak about deep sleep and what happens there. REM sleep is a fascinating time, which is another stage of sleep, often called dream sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep. That stage of sleep, some parts of your brain are up to 30% more active than when you're awake. So again, it's kind of violating this idea that our mind is dormant and our body is just simply quiescent and resting. So I would happy to just sort of double click on either one of those and also what changes in the body as well. But it is an intense evolutionary adaptive benefit and system. That said, though, I would almost push back against an evolved system when we think about the question of sleep and what sleep is. Our assumption has always been that we evolved to sleep. And I've actually questioned that, and I have no way to get in a time capsule and go back and prove this, but what if we started off sleeping and it was from sleep that wakefulness emerged? Why do we assume that it's the other way around? And I think there's probably some really good evidence that sleep may have been the proto state, that it was the basic fundamental living state. And when we became awake, as it were, we always had to return to sleep. In some ways, at that point, sleep was the price that we paid for wakefulness. And that's another way of describing what sleep is. But again, I think it sort of denies the active state of sleep. It's not a passive state of sleep either. And then finally, you can say what is sleep across different species. And in us human beings and in all mammalian species and avian species as well, sleep is broadly separated into these two main types. And we've got non-rapid eye movement sleep on the one hand, and then we've got rapid eye movement sleep on the other. And we can speak about how they unfold across the night and their architecture, because it's not just intellectually interesting from the perspective of what sleep is. It's also practically impactful for our daily lives. And I'd love to sort of go down that route too, but you navigate, you tell me.
Let's definitely go down that route. So you mentioned how active the brain is during certain phases of sleep. When I was coming up in science, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, was referred to as paradoxical sleep. Yeah. Is that still a good way to think about it? Paradoxical because the brain is so active and yet we are essentially paralyzed, correct?
Yeah, it really is a paradox. And where that came from was simply the brainwave recordings. That if all I'm measuring about you is your brainwave activity, it's very difficult for me sitting outside of the sleep laboratory room to figure out, are you awake or are you in REM sleep? Because those two patterns of brain activity are so close to one another, you can't discriminate between them. Yet the paradox is that when you are awake, I go in there and you're sort of sitting up, you're clearly conscious and awake. But yet when you go into REM sleep, you are completely paralyzed. And that's one of I think that's part of the paradox. But the paradox really just comes down to two dramatically different conscious states. Yet brain activity is dramatically more similar than different. And the way I can figure out which of the two you are in is by measuring two other signals, the activity from your eyes and the activity from your muscles. So when we're awake, we will occasionally have these blinks and we'll have sort of saccades. But during REM sleep, you have these really bizarre horizontal shuttling eye movements that occur. And that's where the name comes from, rapid eye movement
Are
sleep.
they always horizontal?
Mostly they are horizontal.
That's interesting.
And that's one of the ways that we can differentiate them from other waking eye movement activity, because it's not always, it can be sometimes horizontal, but can also have diagonal and also vertical in that plane. But then the muscle activity is the real dead giveaway. Just before you enter REM sleep, your brainstem, which is where the dynamics of non-REM and REM are essentially played out and then expressed upstairs in the cortex and downstairs in the body. When we go into REM sleep, and just a few seconds before that happens, the brainstem sends a signal all the way down the spinal cord, and it communicates with what are called the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, which control the voluntary skeletal muscles. And it's a signal of paralysis. And when you go into dream sleep, you are locked into a physical incarceration of your own body.
Amazing.
And, why would Mother Nature do such a thing? And it's in some ways very simple. The brain paralyzes the body so that the mind can dream safely. Because think about how quickly we would have all been popped out of the gene pool. If I think I'm one of the best skydivers who can just simply fly, and I've had sometimes those dreams too, and I get up on my apartment window and I leap out,
You're done.
you're done,
Yeah.
So that's one of the that's part of the paradox of REM sleep, both its brain activity similarity, despite the behavioral state being so different, and this bizarre lockdown of the sort of brain of the body itself. Now, of course, the involuntary muscles, thankfully, aren't paralyzed. So you keep breathing, your heart keeps beating.
Is this why men have erections during REM sleep and women have vaginal lubrication during sleep?
That's one of the reasons. Part of the other reason, though, there is because of the autonomic activity. So there is a part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, and it controls many of the automatic behaviors. And some of those are aspects of our reproductive facilities. During REM sleep, what we later discovered is that you go through these bizarre, what we call autonomic storms, which sounds dramatic, but it actually is when you measure them. That you'll go through periods where your heart rate decelerates and drops, and your blood pressure goes down, and then utterly randomly, your heart rate accelerates dramatically, and what we call the fight or flight branch of the autonomic nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system, badly named because it's anything but sympathetic, it's very aggravating, that all of a sudden fires up, and then it shuts down again. And it's not in any regular way. And it's when you get those autonomic storms, you get very activated from a physiological perspective, that you can have these erections and you have vaginal discharge, etc.
But you're totally paralyzed.
But you are still paralyzed. There are only two voluntary muscle groups that are spurred from the paralysis. Bizarre. One, your extraocular muscles, because if they were paralyzed, you wouldn't be able to have rapid eye movements. And the other that we later discovered was the inner ear muscle. And we've got no good understanding as to why those two muscle groups are spurred from the paralysis. It may have something to do with cranial nerve, but I don't think it's that. I think it's perhaps something more sensory related. Some people have argued that the reason the eyeballs are spurred from the paralysis is because if your eyeballs are left